And now, the moment we've all been waiting for: Active Directory authentication on Linux. Welcome to this video on SQL Server on Linux. My name is Kevin Fiesel, and I'm the proprietor of Catalxy Services LLC, a consulting firm which specializes in work all across the data platform space, especially SQL Server. I've now created several videos covering various topics around SQL Server on Linux. In this video, we are going to configure Active Directory authentication for a SQL Server on Linux instance. As usual, I'm going to spend a bit of classroom time with you before we get into the demo. So let's get going. There are a few things we're going to need before we get started. The first is a Windows server acting as a domain controller for your Active Directory forest. I'm not going to show you how to create one of these, but I will provide a couple of links to help get you started. As a quick note, Windows authentication is about using Active Directory for authentication, not Azure Entra ID, previously known as Azure Active Directory. They are different things, and you cannot use your Azure Entra ID credentials for Windows authentication or vice versa. The second thing you need is a Windows PC connected to the domain. I've got a Windows 11 Enterprise Developer box for this purpose. Again, I'm not going to show you how to connect a Windows machine to an Active Directory domain, but I will provide you some links in case you want to try it out. What we are going to demonstrate is how to get your Linux machine running Ubuntu 22.04 to connect to an Active Directory network and use Active Directory authentication to connect to that SQL Server instance. To this point, we've used SQL Server authentication for everything, and that's fine. But there are security benefits around Windows authentication, particularly in that you don't need to send passwords to the server as a means of authentication, so that means no putting passwords in connection strings or in configuration files. As a result, whenever it's possible, I do prefer using Windows authentication. With that preface out of the way, let's get out of the classroom and into the demo. I am in SQL VM 0, my SQL Server 2022 virtual machine running on Ubuntu 22.04. I have a domain on this network called csmore.info. By the way, a brief bit of shilling. If you go to csmore.info in your browser, you can see all kinds of resources I've made available, including my blog, dozens of presentations and GitHub repos, 2 books, and Curated SQL, where every day I find and link to 5 to 10 blog posts on topics all across the data platform space. There's a lot I do for you people, and most of it is free, so check it out. Alright, unpaid advertisement aside, let's figure out what we need to do. There is a Linux tool called adutil that we can use to configure our Windows Active Directory domain. Unfortunately, it doesn't officially support Ubuntu 22.04 at this time. It's not in the 22.04 package list. If you are running Ubuntu 20.04, instructions are pretty easy. But I do have a roundabout way to get this working with Ubuntu 22.04 until they officially support it, so stick with me here. The first step is to add an Active Directory user for SQL Server to act as a service account. In the Active Directory Users and Computers utility, under the users listing for my AD Forest, we can see an account called SQL Server Service. If I double click on that user and navigate to the Account tab, we can see that its username is SQL Service. Another thing I'm going to need to do is make sure that the account is enabled for AES encryption. In the Account Options menu, I need to scroll down and check the boxes for AES 128 and 256-bit encryption. Let me close out of this and show you the other user we've created. This is Linux User, a standard user account for somebody who would like to connect to our SQL Server instance. Everything looks good, so let's move to the next step. We'll switch to the DNS Manager and navigate to the forward lookup zones for csmore.info. Inside of here, I'm going to right-click and add a new A-name record. My name will be SQL VM 0, and the IP address is what I'm going to paste in here. I will also create an associated pointer record. Something I created beforehand is a reverse lookup zone for the IP range 172.20. If I drill in, we can see a few entries, including one for SQL VM 0A, which is a machine I used to test all of this out pre-recording. I also have a pointer record for a Windows 11 dev box, and if I refresh the screen, we should now see one for SQL VM 0 as well. At this point, we have everything we need from the domain controller. So let's pick it back up from here in Linux. The first thing I will do in Linux is to change my DNS server to use the Windows Domain Controller, where I've also set it up as a DNS host. That way, it knows about the csmore.info forest and other computers in the domain. To do that, I will install a tool called resolve-conf. Now this will take just a few moments for installation to complete, so let's be patient. Once installation has completed, I can modify a configuration file. Inside this file, I will add two new lines. The first will tell it about csmore.info, and the second will point to my domain controller as a DNS name server. I'll save the file and exit VI. From there, we'll need to enable the resolve-conf service and then restart the resolve daemon. And just to make sure that did the trick, I'm going to reboot this machine, so do bear with me for just a moment. And we're back. At this point, our DNS provider should be the domain controller, and I can check that by pinging csmore and csmore.info, both of which we should be able to route to our domain controller's IP address. So this is looking good. Everything is pinging correctly, so I think we're set up. The next step is to install several packages. The first batch of packages includes realmd and the Kerberos 5 client. I'm also installing a few dependencies for adutil. During installation, I'm going to need to enter my default Kerberos version 5 realm. I'll put in csmore.info here and strike enter. Once that's done installing, I will then install the packages for SSSD, the System Security Services daemon. Installation worked for this as well, so let's keep moving. I'm going to make the host name of my Linux server sequelvm0.csmore.info using the hostname command. Now that I've done that, I'll use realm to join the csmore domain. This takes a moment and spits out some messages, but what we're looking for is a message that says successfully enrolled machine in realm. We can see it at the bottom of the screen, so we know we're in good shape. Now we're going to want to get a little off the beaten path. Like I mentioned, Microsoft does not have a version of the adutil package suitable for Ubuntu 22.04, but we're going to yank it from the Ubuntu 20.04 repository using the following command. Then I can install the package using Debian's package manager, dpackage. Note that it tells us we need to accept a EULA before running, so let me give that a try. And this gives us an error that it's missing LDAP R 2.4. Well, that's because Ubuntu 22.04 doesn't have this library. It has live LDAP R 2.5 installed. Fortunately, we can install 2.4 using a similar method. First, I'll grab the Debian package. And then, I'll install that package. We'll give it a moment to install. Once it's done, we'll be able to try adutil one more time. This time around, it does work, so we can pick up with the remaining steps. Hopefully, there will be official support for Ubuntu 22.04 forthcoming, but at least in the meantime, this will unblock people. Now we're going to finish up the process with adutil, so let's first switch over to the root user. This will make the next several steps easier. After I log in as root, I can use kinit to grab a Kerberos token for my domain administrator. Now this doesn't have to be a domain administrator, but it does need to be a user on the domain with enough privileges to add Active Directory objects and set service principal names. And for me, that's my domain admin. I've entered my password and we can continue along. The next step is to create those service principal names, or SPNs. I'm going to create them using the adutil application, like so. This will automatically add all of the SPNs I need, assigning them to the SQL Service account and tying them to the SQL VM0 host on port 1433. I'll also accept the EULA again because I'm very accepting that way. Once I have the SPNs created, the next step is to set up a key tab file, and MS SQL Conf can help us with this. You can certainly create a key tab file yourself in Windows and use a command like scp or secure copy to move it over to your Linux box. Or you could run the following command and it will do all of the work for you. We're saying that the eventual key tab file will go into /var/opt/msql/secrets and be called msql.keytab. The Active Directory account name we want associated with all of this is the SQL Service account. After that command completes, we can check out the key tab entries and make sure they are correct. In Linux, I can use the klist command to do just that. This will output several entries for SQL VM0 and SQL Service. This all looks okay to me, but I'm not the final arbiter for this. Instead, we can validate our Active Directory configuration using MS SQL Conf. Now this does take a moment and it will spit out a fair amount of text. If there are any problems with Active Directory setup, we would see the errors in here, but it looks like everything is fine, and I'm happy with that. I'm not an expert on Active Directory or Kerberos, and I'd rather spend my time connecting to SQL Server on Linux versus fighting weird AD issues. The last thing that we'll need to do is make sure that we are using the key tab and Active Directory service account for SQL Server. To do that, once again, we'll return to the MS SQL Conf well. Assuming you don't get any errors through this part of the process, it is safe to restart SQL Server. Let's give it a moment. We'll make sure that the service will start up successfully. Now we can tell that it's up by running the status command. And yes, it does look good. We're so close to being done, but not quite yet. I need to do one little thing, and that is to add Active Directory logins to my SQL Server service. I'm connected to SQL VM0 in Azure Data Studio using my regular SQL authentication. In order for users to connect to this machine, I'll need to create a login. Let's do that for our Linux user account. After I do this, I can grant rights. I'd like to create a user account for Linux user. He'll have connect rights against the master database. I'll also create a user in the Scratch database and grant him read-only permissions. Well, with that, all that's left is for us to connect to the box. I'm going to show you two different ways to connect to this machine. The first uses a Windows VM and SQL Server Management Studio. I am logged into this machine as John J. Linux user, a perfectly regular Linux user who sadly has to use a Windows machine. I'll open up a new connection to SQL VM0. In the Options menu, I need to switch to the Connection Properties tab. In there, I'll make sure that the boxes are checked for Encrypt Connection and Trust Server Certificate. In the prior video, we made this server require encrypted connections, but we are using a self-signed certificate, which is why we need to trust it. Let's connect, and we're in. It's as simple as that. Once you've done all the grunt work of setting this up, it's just click and you're in. Let's switch over to the Scratch database and run a query just to make sure it doesn't all fall apart on us at the end. We do get back rows, and that's good enough for me. But this isn't the only way we can connect to this server. Oh no. Let's also connect from the Linux box itself. We've spent all of this time getting Active Directory up and running, so let's take advantage of it. I'm going to navigate to the download page for Azure Data Studio. To do that, let's do a web search for Azure Data Studio download. That should get us to the right page, and I'm going to download the Debian package. While that downloads, I'll get prepared for the next step. I'll exit out of my root shell and navigate to the downloads directory. Then, once Azure Data Studio is downloaded completely, we'll be able to install it using dpackage. Next up, I'll need to make sure that I've created a Kerberos token for my Linux user account. To do that, I can use the kinit command and specify a Linux user at csmore.info. I'll have to type in my password, and once it's done and Azure Data Studio is installed, I'll be able to open up Azure Data Studio from the Ubuntu menu. I will have a little bit of rigmarole to deal with because this is the first time I'm opening Azure Data Studio, so I want to enable preview features, I want to hide some stuff. but give me a moment, I'll get everything in place. There. Okay, let's select the Connections menu and create a new connection. I'll type in SQL VM0 as the host name and choose Windows Authentication. We are going to force encryption and trust the server certificate. And voila, we are officially connected to SQL VM0 using Windows Authentication. To make sure all is well, I'll open up a new query window and run the following query. This retrieves the actual username, which is csmore/Linux user. And that's exactly what I want to see. So it's time to kick back and declare a victory. But before I do that, one quick note. You can also create Active Directory groups. They have to be security groups, but you can use those with SQL Server on Linux as well. So if you're used to creating AD groups and using them in Windows, it'll work the same on Linux. This was a big one for me. I've got to let you in on a little bit of a secret, dear viewer. Before I put together this episode, I never actually set up Active Directory authentication for SQL Server on Linux. A few years ago, this was a pretty big challenge with a lot of manual steps and required that you be good with server administration and with Kerberos. Today, however, it's pretty easy, especially if you have someone knowledgeable in charge of setting up your domain controllers and Active Directory. I didn't because I set up my own, but even then I still muddled through and we got it working. We'll have links and show notes in the description below, and until we see each other in the next video, take care.